Hamilton Arts Council serves arts communities within the greater Hamilton area and the traditional territories upon which it sits, including Ancaster, Dundas, Flamborough, Glanbrook, Hamilton, Stony Creek, Waterdown, and Six Nations of the Grand River. We acknowledge that the area we serve is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Hamilton continues to be home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, North America, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. So without further ado, introducing Erin Jan, playwright, director, arts administrator, and grant writer.
Hey, hi, it's great to see all you empty boxes. Let's do this. Okay. All right. How did we do this last time? We were in view, full screen mode. Okay. Hi. Let's begin this presentation. My name's Aaron. I'm a director, dramaturg, and playwright and producer. I'm less sweaty than normal because it's fall and I'm usually quite cold. I have produced projects with budgets of $50 to $101,000. I've also won a bunch of grants at all three levels of funding. That's municipal, the Hamilton Community Enrichment Fund, provincial, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Canada Council for the Arts. And I've served on many juries throughout the years. So while I don't work for the arts councils, as an officer, I have won loads of funding from them. And I've also been on the other side, giving and denying people funding. So this presentation is kind of from the perspective of an artist applying for money, as opposed to someone from the arts councils being like, yes or no. I'm not that person. Maybe you have someone else from the councils coming in, but I'm not that person. So I'm kind of from the ground up. Yeah. Heads up, this is a theater presentation. Many of the unions talked about will not cross into other disciplines. Film actors are not contracted under CAEA, but under ACTRA, unless you're doing a live stream of your performance. I'm not getting into that, but I'm going to be using theater terms. So if you're like, oh, I am a filmmaker, I'm going to look at the CAEA stuff, maybe not be up your boat, but there are stuff that cross over. Just a fair warning. Okay, so what is a budget? A budget is an estimate of income and expenditure for a set period of time. That was from dictionary.com. In theater, these are your expenses and revenues, which I usually track in Excel. Expenses, what are you spending money on? And revenue, how much money are you bringing in to balance the budget and pay for expenses? These can include donations, fundraising, box office grants, et cetera, et cetera. Expenses can also include venue and rehearsal space, equipment rental, costumes, props, insurance, and merch. Also childcare. Childcare can also be an expense. And people. People cost money. Never forget about this. Often we're making the transition from indie to professional or community theater to a more professional setting. We sometimes forget to cost people. People should be the primary thing you're spending money on, because as professional artists, we want to get paid. So as we kind of transition, if we're kind of transitioning from a community theater model to an independent artist model, don't forget about people. It's not just about the brick and mortar, it's also about the people. So how do you begin making a budget, right? Well, the first thing I do is I make a list of everything you need in your production that costs money. Actors, directors, designers, blah, 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 blah. Anything you need to make the show happen. These are your expenses. So once you made a list of every single thing that costs you money, this is before you're sourcing things, this is before you're getting things for free, you make a list of every single line of your budget that costs money. And now you're going to cost them based on union rates. So what is a union? Wikipedia tells me that a union is a group that ensures fair wages, benefits, and better working conditions for their members. Unions determine minimum fees when engaging their members. Even when I'm working on non-union projects with non-union artists, I always budget to pay people at least equity minimums. This helps my grant score in general. because then it's like, oh, even though he's not engaging equity people, he's still paying them the same amount that he would pay if they were engaged on an equity contract. If someone isn't backed by a union, or there is not a union that represents them, like producers don't have a union, asking their rate is a good way to determine what you put on a grant. And we'll talk about this later, but it's also really important on your budgets that you explain how you got to that amount. For example, if you're doing a show and you're paying your actors $6,000, okay, but why are they being paid that? Are you calculating it hourly? Are you looking at the standard union rates? I always use the Canadian Actors Equity website as a basis when I determine how much to pay people. And those are minimums. So paying above minimums makes you look like a superhero. So this is a rough breakdown of some unions you may encounter. Fight directors, actors, directors, stage managers, child handlers, stage managers, assistant SMs, they're all part of a union called Canadian Actors Equity. Yes, that includes stage managers. Yes, that includes directors. Yes, that includes child wranglers. And everyone on the equity website has a different minimum that they deserve to be paid based on union agreements that Actors Equity has negotiated for. Dancers and choreographers can be contracted under that was me being bad. Dancers and choreographers can be contracted under CAEA, or they can be contracted under CATA, which is the Canadian Alliance of Dance Artists, but you can't mix and match. Like, you have a choreographer on a CATA contract, you can't also have a bunch of dancers on a CAEA contract. It's mostly up to what the dancers really want, but in general, whenever I've engaged dancers, the dancers I work with seem to enjoy CAEA better. And if you're thinking Aaron is throwing on a bunch of acronyms, I hate this presentation, don't worry, we're going to work through the equity website together. Playwrights are contracted under PGC standards, which is the Playwrights Guild. If you want to know what those minimum rates are, email the Playwrights Guild and they can give you those rates. Dramaturgs under the LMDA, which is the Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. Designers have their own union. Designers are not paid CAEA rates. They are paid rates under the Associate Designers of Canada. And they have different tiers too. Even if you're on a profit share gig where everyone is being paid profit share, designers have a set minimum that they must be paid if they're a member of the design union. Musicians are contracted under the TMA. I'm not sure if that's the same for Hamilton. I don't know how the Brought Festival figures out their musicians funds, but they do set it on minimums. If you are engaging musicians in Hamilton, I would just poke around and find out who's representing your musicians of the area. Visual artists and speakers are often contracted under CARFAC, and I believe there's a CARFAC speaker coming in who can talk more about that. But today, we're going to navigate this scary website, Canadian Actors Equity. Which agreement do I use? When I just got out of theater school, this website terrified me. I looked at it and I screamed. I was like, I hate this. There's so many numbers. But recently I figured this out. This is me using my pandemic knowledge to help you. So let's break down what this website means and which agreement you use. To engage, if you are working with union artists, you should send a request to Equity as early as 4 weeks before you start rehearsals. You can check the CAEA website for more info. As someone who doesn't normally engage equity actors, I don't really have to contact Equity if none of them are Equity, but I still use the CAEA agreements as best practice minimums when I build my budgets. So even though I'm not constantly contacting Equity, I'm still using their website to determine my minimums when I build my grants. When you have a grant presentation this Hamilton Arts Week, know that your budget in your grant is scored in a category called viability. If your budget is poor, the jury who's evaluating your grant will give you a low viability score, which will cause you to fail the grant. So just so you know, like, yeah, this helps you win grants. CAEA agreements cover tours, workshops, productions, rehearsals, blah, 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 you name it. There's often a different fee associated with each kind of engagement, so read through the documents carefully. For example, a little workshop at Theatre Passe Muraille will pay drastically different than if you're standing in the middle of the Royal Alex stage versus if you're doing a Theatre for Young Audiences tour across 3 cities. Those are 3 different pay scales, and they're 3 different pages of the equity agreement. There are many different ways of engaging CAE artists actively using agreements, so let's dive in and break these down. This is what you do if you're on a profit share. A profit share is when you make profit and you divide the money amongst your collective. Putting a profit share on a grant is suicide because it is your way of saying to the granting body, we're not going to pay people. Profit share is not a sustainable, real way to pay people. You will lose the grant if you're on profit share. In general, the whole idea of the reason arts councils and granting was created was it was to give artists money. So you're only using a collective policy if you're engaging artists through profit share with no guaranteed weekly wage and a box office split. An example of this would be me and my buddies are doing Hamlet at a park for fun. We'll split box office with no guarantee of revenue. If you're using equity artists, you'll fill out one of these forms and send them back to equity. What this does is it protects the artists who are on equity from unethical work conditions, but also it gives them benefits. For example, when my equity artist friends are on profit share contracts, some of them are able to get free massages. So this contract is really useful if you're engaging people on a fun gig or a fringe gig or one where you're not expected to make income. But don't put this on a grant. If you put this, if you're like, I'm paying people profit share on a grant, I will be on your jury being like, what are you doing? What are you doing? If you're having a benefit or a fundraiser, there is a separate agreement on the website for people who are doing benefits or fundraisers, and the rates are different. For example, I don't know if you're raising money for cancer, right? That would be considered a benefit, which is a single performance where the process will be given to a charity or charitable purpose, and the fees are different for that. If you're doing a fundraiser, where it will be given to a not-for-profit company, whether the company is charitable status or not. If you're doing a fundraiser for your indie company and people are being paid professional wages on this fundraiser, consult the benefits and fundraisers section of the CAEA website. If you're not doing a benefit or fundraiser, you don't have to worry about this. Coincidentally, if you're not doing profit share, you don't have to worry about this. So a lot of the stress of the CAEA website is they're going to throw 30 PDFs at you, but if it doesn't apply to you, you don't have to engage with it. Okay. CTA agreement. You're only going to use this agreement if you are a PACT registered theater, the Professional Association of Canadian Theaters. If you are not a PACT registered theater, don't look at this booklet. If you are the Second City, that improv company, and that sketch company, they have a separate booklet just for them. If you are not Second City, you will ignore this booklet. Okay, now here's where we start to play with a little bit of fire. If you are a professional theater company who is not PACT registers, you are going to look into the Independent Theater Agreement, or the ITA. This is kind of the bread and butter of kind of what we're working with the independent scene. You will also notice that the scale of pay for these engagements is based on ticket prices and your max box office potential based on ticket prices and the number of seats for production. As you can see in this little image to the right, we are in the year 2022. So if you fall within any of these ranges, you're considered this type of house. For example, if your maximum box office gross is, oh my gosh, that's like over, that's a lot of money. $157,258.51. You are considered an A house. So that means that your entire run, the maximum amount of tickets sold at its full price, and that's your total gross, you're looking at an A category. If you're a little dinky indie company and you're only making a max gross of $20,000 at box office, you're considered a G house. So just know that as these numbers and like alphabet soup things start appearing and you're like, I don't know what the letters mean, just go back to this form. This is on one of the first pages of the equity agreement, but it's based on your max box office potential, based on if you sell out the entire run and every single seat in the theater. Stratford and Shaw, by the way, are in their own categories, which is why they're not in the ITA. There's a Stratford category and there's a Shaw category. As you see, the spreadsheet, right? Say you're an actor in a G House production in the year 2023, next year. If you're in a G House, the minimum fee for an actor would be $842.75. This is for production. This is not for workshop. But you see how this works, right? In terms of the not numerical. Oh my gosh, the alphabetical categories. The alphabetical categories, as we saw, are based off of our total box office yield should we sell out the entire run. So naturally, the G house is a lot smaller than the A house, and this is a minimum, right? These are minimum fees. You can pay above these fees, but this is considered an equitable minimum for actors in a production, in a show. As you see, though, it changes based on what you're doing. Are you doing a theater for young audiences show? Then it appears that because the box office is different there, those letters, they're letters, not numbers. Those letters don't matter in a TOA contract. You're doing a workshop with no public fee for a public presentation. Those letters don't matter. So as you see, the rate is different. If I'm acting in a workshop that is a 4-week equity process, which is like 8-hour rehearsal days, 6 days a week, I'm being paid a minimum of $656 a week in 2021. And of course, this year it's risen. Compare that, of course, to the production a slide ago, right? And the fee is a lot higher on every category. The reason this fee is lower is because there's no box office guaranteed and a bunch of other factors. But just know that those letter grades are usually only good if you're doing productions. But if you're developing work, if you're in workshop, if you're doing a TYA tour, the situation changes. So don't assume one spreadsheet tracks everything. So that is the ITA. Now, if you're like, that's a little too rich for my blood. I'm a lower budget company. Am I screwed? The answer is no. There's a handy thing called the Indy 2.2. So what is the Indy? You can use the Indy 2.2 if, as a theater, your company has operational funding of less than $50,000 a year. So if you're getting government funding, like Tottering Biped, for example, in Hamilton gets like 20, 30K a year. I just made it up. I have no idea how much Trevor makes in a year, or maybe I do. You'll find that in the second presentation. But if you have less than $50,000 of operational funding in a year, you're eligible. If you're a non-commercial entity, i.e. you are not a for-profit company like Mirvish, who uses profit to pay people rather than funding, you're eligible. And if you prove that you cannot pay the minimum fees in the ITA or CTA, you're eligible. What are minimum fees? For example, if you're like, oh my gosh, I can't afford to pay actors $842 a week based on our current budget, then if you have that factor in your favor, then you are eligible to apply for the Indy 2.2. As a theater, the production you're producing as an Indy 2.2 has a budget of less than $75,000, has a box office potential of less than $18,000 of total gross at max capacity. You're not in a co-production with a company that's using the ITA or CTA, and it doesn't compete directly with like a TYA contract. So if you are these things, you are eligible to pay people equitable amounts that are union reinforced. So what are these amounts? The beautiful thing about the 2.2 is you can pay people profit share. So if you're like, hey, I have a profit share, but I also want to pay people a weekly fee, what is an ethical way of doing this? The Indy 2.2 is an ethical way of doing that. To apply, the company must send equity an Indy 2.2 application a minimum of 4 weeks before rehearsal start. The forum proves didn't lie about the contract. This 2.2 contract engages everyone, and everyone is paid the exact same wage on a 2.2. So as a director, I would be sharing in this weekly payment plus a profit share. So if you have a profit share at the end, before 2020, it was a minimum fee of $310 a week. But with no profit share before 2020, it was a minimum of $610 a week. So again, if you don't have a lot of funding, but you still want to pay people equitably, and you prove that you cannot pay based on your current budget, the ITA minimums, and you don't want to pay people profit share, look at the 2.2. This also works for fringe productions. There's a bad rumor that you can't win grants if you're a fringe production. That is fundamentally untrue. The big thing that they don't like seeing on fringe grants is just paying people purely based on profit share. If you're running a fringe project, you want to pay people ethically, maybe look at the 2.2 and engaging them. And you can base your minimum rates on the 2.2 if you're not engaging equity artists like I usually roll with. In the 2.2, everyone is under the same agreement. Everyone is paid the same weekly. It is the easiest agreement to navigate if you can't afford the IT rates, but want to pay your actors more than pathetic profit share, or if you want to use profit share as a bonus. $310 a week sounds embarrassing, right? That's the minimum. You can go higher. It's also a more ethical way to pay people on a festival contract rather than going to peer collective policy. Because we go to a peer collective policy, right? Then we're showing our hand to the jury and we're like, I only want to pay people when we make money at the box office, which should not be how you fund your productions if you consider yourself a professional artist. The dot. Use the dot if you're engaging equity members at educational institutions for performances. For example, if you're only engaging one equity member and don't want everyone else to be bound by the agreement. The dot doesn't bind everyone in the production, just the equity member. For example, if, I don't know, you're doing a show at a university and you're like, oh, you know what? We need an old man on stage and none of the students can play old men. I'm going to find a professional actor and I'm going to bring him in on a professional contract so the students learn how to act with an actor of another generation. That's when the dot would come in. The dot is divided into two tiers for paying people. Tier 1, your max box office gross is less than this number. Tier 2, the max box office gross is more than this number. As you can see, it's a set weekly fee based on what tier you're in. I know for my company, Silk Bath Collective, we had artists, we were paying all of our artists on a dot just because it's easier for us in terms of contracting them. But just look at the different tiers in terms of engagement. Designers. Okay, remember how I said designers have their own union? They do. This is not on the equity website. ADC has their own little spreadsheet. This isn't, as you can see, this is an outdated version of it. But if you're on the Associate Designers of Canada, this is the minimums you should be paying people. Also, you will notice that Indie 2.2 and Profit Share are on their own tiers. If you are deigning to do a profit share and you're engaging an equity artist on an equity contract, especially an equity designer, you have to pay them the minimums. They're not involved in the profit share. The Designers Association of Canada actually protects their members against profit share gigs. As you see the different tiers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but you know that ADC is on a completely different website. Everything I just talked about is on the CAEA website, the Canadian Actors Equity, but ADC is on its own page. Okay, so you're like, wow, that was a lot of numbers, but where's my union as a producer? You don't have one. There's no union supporting producers. But ask yourself, what are you worth? When I produce, I pay myself the same I would pay a director because I feel our hours are equivalent. Other artists would argue that producers will be 10% of the budget because without them, the show can't happen. So as long as you're justifying how much you're able to pay yourself as a producer, just make it so and put it in the budget notes. But just remember that producing is not free. This is a job. And if you're hiring someone who's not protected by a union, ask them what their rate is, and then you can put that in your budget notes. Okay, so you've calculated everything. Now what? Did you remember to count for HST? Often I do a grant and I'm like, the budget is balanced. Amazing. I'm fine. Your goal is to balance the budget where everything equals zero because we work in nonprofit, which does not mean people don't get paid. Nonprofit just means that there is no profit to be shared, that the amount of money you put in is balanced by the amount of money it costs for everything. That includes people. One of your budget lines for expenses should be HST. This can also double as contingency. Contingency, I'm going to swear, is the oh shit, we lost everything, or oh shit, something didn't come in. I no longer put contingency lines. I just put an HST line / contingency because not everything will be taxable, right? For example, as a theater artist, I have an HST number. So when you engage me, you have to pay 13% on top of that. But for my own collective, Silk Bath Collective, we have literally assumed everyone and everything on the production costs HST. So then we have a nice little cushion for yourself. So once you calculate everything, add an HST line where you're costing 13% on every single thing. And this can also double for contingency. The game of contingency. So often on projects, there will be a question being like, what if you don't get the full amount? Can you proceed? There is no shame in saying you can't do the project if you don't win the grant. There's no shame in that at all. In fact, it's more honest, being like, hey, I'll wait till next year. Because we don't want to pay our artists below minimum fees. We want to execute this to the best degree possible. However, contingency is also a chance for you to show your values and wax poetic. If you are able to proceed, assuming you don't win all of your funding, what are you willing to cut / what are you not willing to cut? I remember, I can't say the name of this time being recorded right now, but I remember when I was on a TAC jury, there was an application we fought against. The jury hated it. But I remember in their contingency statement, they said, we are unwilling to cut our childcare, that we are paying our artists, we're paying childcare for our artists, and that's not something we were willing to cut. And as a result, we need this grant specifically for it. What I thought about the project no longer mattered because I saw, based on their contingency statement, they were taking care of their artists. Never sacrifice people. If you are saying, oh, we will go ahead, like we will go ahead with the project if we don't get full funding, be clear about what you're sacrificing. Because if as a jury member, I see you're sacrificing people, then that's 17 red flags around my head. Sacrificing people means that, oh, this person is not going to get paid, or, oh, this person's wage is going to be peanuts. Okay, so now I've calculated everything with HST and my budget looks huge. Now start seeing what you can get for free and discounted. Then that's how you start reducing the budget. Ask yourself as producer, what do I actually need? What can I do without? Do I need to buy a disco ball? Or can I just borrow it from my high school teacher who has 7 disco balls in his attic? Use your network and source things. Like, do we really have to make that lion costume, or does my high school drama class have things I can borrow because I wasn't a jerk? Never sacrifice people. If you're cutting people's wages in your reduction, ask yourself why and how. These grants exist so we can pay people. If you wanted people to work for free, you would be a community theater artist. In the case that you are having people work for free, ask yourself how you can make this ethical. Does your friend's son want to get like 50 volunteer hours? How can you make this an ethical, reciprocal experience if you are cutting bodies and getting volunteer labor? After you've reduced everything to what the essentials are to make sure the production happens at its full artistic value without any bloat, that is your budget for expenses. Okay, now that you have an expenses spreadsheet, your job is to budget enough revenue to equal in your expenses. In general, granting agencies don't want to see a profit because you're already paying people as an expense. They want to see the revenue equal the expenses. Just to say that again, when you balance a budget and you're applying for grants, they do not want to see a profit because there's no profit to be shared. Everyone is getting paid an equity wage, a fair wage, because you built that into your budget. Your revenue must equal your expenses. What can you use as revenue? In-kind donations that would cost money. For example, I just did a Hamilton Fringe show where the Hamilton Fringe paid for a slot. We got it for free, but that was a line of revenue because they gave us that slot for free. You can use your box office as revenue. This is bad, and I'll tell you why this is bad very shortly. You can use grants for revenue. This is good. Fundraising and donors. This is great. So you're telling me you're just like, oh my gosh, Aaron, what a fool. I will use my box office revenue. I will make millions of dollars at the box office. And I'm like, good on you, sport. There was a theater in Toronto called the Lower Ossington Theater that no longer exists. Why does the Lower Ossington Theater no longer exist? Because a pandemic happened. And the only way the Lower Ossington Theater was supporting itself was through box office. If you rely heavily on your box office, you're relying heavily on an unpredictable value. Like, what if a thunderstorm happened and rained out your entire run and people don't want to make it in the rain? What if a pandemic happens and half your audiences are halved? What if your show gets bad reviews and people stop showing up? Box office is an unreliable way to bank on revenue. When I budget for box office, I always budget super low. So if people show up, I just get to pay my artists more. And if people don't show up, then I'm fine. Alternatively, too, what if you want to comp the entire run, or what if the majority of your audience are like lower income students who really want to see it at drastically reduced prices? There are so many variables in people coming to the theater, right? If you're basing a lot of your revenue on box office, you're going to fall flat in your face. The only people who do that are multi-million-dollar organizations. Broadway banks a lot on their box office because how many people are seeing those shows? Broadway's desperate for ticket sales. Stratford, even though they are a nonprofit, I think like 90+% of their budget is on ticket sales because they're an international theater event. But think about how many people are in Stratford right now and how many people are shelling out money at the shows, right? Do you have that same effect? Up to you, but like, that's why our nonprofit industry exists, right? That like we are doing art and we're getting paid for art and we're not banking on the profit of it. So don't bank on box office. If you do, let's have a conversation. Okay, smart guy. So how do I like get funding if I don't rely on box office? Or rather, it's cut off. What does this say? How do I move this bar? I move the bar. Okay. How do I factor in my box office then? So when I factor in box office, when I budget box office into my revenue tab, I make an estimate based on how many tickets I'll actually sell. If I exceed that, I just up people's fees. Because remember, the beautiful thing, right, about all these fees is their minimums, right? If you report that you actually paid people more money because your box office did better, good for you, sport. Oh, and now things are weird. Oh my God. Okay, this is not a presentation about grants. This is a presentation about budget. But I want to talk to you about fundraising because there's a big misconception about what fundraising is. Fundraising is not asking for handouts. Fundraising is about relationship building, about going after specific people who match the values your project instills. Sometimes this isn't even about the art, but the impact the art provides. Shakespeare in the Park gets funding, not because people like Shakespeare, although maybe people do like Shakespeare, but because the donors have an invested interest in the park and community events. The impact, what is the impact of your art? And then you go after specific people based on that. Fundraising is not putting up an Indiegogo and walking away. Strangers do not donate unless you ask them one-on-one individually. Okay. This is based on an activity I did with my producing mentor, Christina Lemieux from Generator. Scotiabank had a motto a few years ago called "You're richer than you think." When I was a child, I ignored this. Then I realized it was true. This is an activity called donor prospecting. Think about everyone in the world who can give you money for your project. Literally everyone, from Cardi B to your grandma, write them down. Now rank them in terms of difficulty. With 0 being, I can ask them on FaceTime and they'll fund me, to 5 being, it'll take me 5 years to even set up a meeting. After you've ranked them in terms of difficulty, assign each person a dollar amount based on how much their values align with the values created by giving money to your project. By this way, you can actually calculate how much money you can make by putting in a requisite amount of effort. When I fundraise, I'm lazy and cowardly. So I only go after level 0s and level 1s. By doing this though, by doing this donor prospecting activity, you can see how much money you can realistically make through fundraising based on your comfort level. Also be aware of time. Anybody above a level 2 will take more time. This ranking system is also based on personal needs. For example, because I am cowardly, my level 1s were, hey, I can call you and have a 15-minute conversation and convince you. Anything above that for me was level 2 and I got stressed out. But the way you evaluate these levels is different. Just know that like the higher the difficulty level goes, the more time it will take. Like Salah Bashir, for example, is a level 5 for me. That guy's a multimillionaire. He runs Cineplex in Toronto, runs all these queer fundraising groups. I will not be able to meet with him for years. Like I might not be able to get $1 million donation from Salah Bashir because that might take me 5 to 10 years to even get a meeting. But if I had a 5 to 10 year window to raise funds, I could spend all the time on Salah, or I could go after other people who are in my network or other people who are in my prospecting. You do have people in your life who will give you money for your projects. You do. Here's more little science nerd time. We buy products and spend money in this economy because we have pains. I bought a PS5 because I had the pain of being bored and I wanted to keep up and play new video games. That was a real pain I had. When you're going after specific donors, think about what their pains are, and by how funding your campaign, you can help alleviate those pains. For example, I do not, but hypothetically give money to Fujian Asian Canadian Theater because I have a pain of feeling like I don't belong in Western society. By giving money to Asian Canadian theater makers, I alleviate my pain of not belonging by supporting a company that tells stories that empower my experiences. It's not about the work, it's about the impact of the work and what it does. So when you're fundraising, you're pitching donors and you're pitching to people in your donor prospect and you're building those fundraising packages, ask yourself, what's your fundraising narrative? Why support? You're in Hamilton. Some of you are in Hamilton. Many of you aren't in Hamilton. I recognize some of you. It's weird that you're in this Zoom, but that's fine. Like Jeff Young, what are you doing here? This is super weird. But what's your fundraising narrative? For example, for Hamilton-based companies, right? The biggest narrative is this: I want professional arts to succeed in Hamilton. I find like there's such a thriving community theater scene in town, but there's little to do with professional theater organizations other than Red Betty and Tottering Biped. And those companies have specific fundraising angles because they hit specific pains in communities. I know when I ran the Garden Project a few years ago, which was a project that funded IPOC artists in the city, our big pain was artists of color leave the city because they're not funded at an early age. If you fund us, like we can keep artists of color in the city because they all feel a sense of community. Our donor prospecting was based on who cares about people of color in the city and who cares about artists of color in the city. There's a whole complex algorithm I did to factor if you did care about artists of color in the city, but like that was a pain we went after. It's people of color and artists of color and people who support artists of color notice that they were leaving the city. The Garden Project was created to keep them there, and we raised like, I think $20,000 in 2 weeks. Like we raised a lot of money really quickly. So think about pains and values when you're building it. It's not just about the art. It's about what your art does and what it does to the people in the project and what it does for community. Remember, there are other ways to get donations that are not money. Sponsorship is when you offer something and you get something in return. For example, I had a Fringe show last year called Tin Can Telephone. I know we're talking about Fringe, but everything's producing. I was like, I could pay money on print ads, or I could work with this pizza shop that has 7,000 followers, and they could sell a pizza in our name randomly, and we could pump them whenever we sold out. We did that, and like our spread increased. Like we didn't need to spend money on the marketing because we had this weird pizza agreement. It was super strange. I don't really know how it worked out, but we sold really well that year. My point is that it doesn't always have to be money. For example, in your donor prospecting, you're like, I need 300 disco balls. Can you find someone who will give you 300 disco balls for advertising for their disco? I don't know. I'm just making stuff up. Sponsorship requires prospecting. The same thing. When you think about all those people, right? You grade them between 0 and 5, and you find out who is the most likely to give you all of your disco balls with the least amount of labor. Alternatively, if you want to go for the big labor, you can, but like I'm lazy and I like going for cheaper asks. I'm going to admit this person. Why not? Ooh. This is a kid who had a pizza party. No one showed up. My personal feeling is that fundraising events are a waste of time at the indie level, unless you're YPT and you host fancy parties for millionaires. Fundraising events don't make nearly enough money as crowdfunding campaigns. There's also a labor cost of venue rental. What fundraising events are good for is promoting your company and having donors remember them. I'm going to tell you a story. I did a next stage show called Gotting a few years ago, and we raised money at a fundraising event. We rented out an art gallery. We had a 3-course meal served by an executive chef. We had wine pairings. We sold out our event. It was a gala. We dressed in suits. So that was our event. My colleague, Ali Joy Richardson, had a show called A Bear Awake in Winter. She had a GoFundMe for $2,500. They're just going to raise that in a week. Guess how much money we raised at our fancy sold out dinner? $500 of profit. Ali raised $2,500 by just going after her friends on Indiegogo. My point is, fundraising events are like shows. Yes, we made we made $500 of profit, but we lost so much time preparing the event that could have been done to other things. If we had a full season of shows, maybe it would have been a good idea. But I find if you are good at building relationships with your donors, if you're good at donor prospecting, you don't need a fundraising event. Also, who's going to go to your fundraising event? The same people will go to your shows. Wouldn't you rather have them spend money at your show? So I don't know. That's my soapbox moment. I think these events are a waste of time. Don't be like this little boy. You can get pizza online. Don't have a pizza party where no one shows up. Also, it's pandemic. I want to go to shows. I don't want to go to your fundraiser. Okay, congrats. You've made a budget. Oh my God, congratulations. Good job, good job. Your expenses and revenue have canceled each other out. Now you have to explain how you got those amounts. On the OAC and TAC, you need to submit a separate document. There's a budget calculator on the website. For the CCA, you can literally input the explanation in the budget spreadsheet you submit to them. Remember how like when you were in high school or elementary school and your teacher was like, show your work for your math and you were like, that's ridiculous. That'll never come back. It's coming back in a real way. So I did a workshop with Gating. Surprisingly, last year during the pandemic, we pulled this off. How strange. But we did. So this was my budget breakdown. So I submitted my budget to the Ontario Arts Council. And then on a separate document, based on the union fees at the day, I broke down everyone's fees, as you see, based on equity agreements. And I cite which part of the equity agreement we're going after. Also, I noted that people were being paid above union standards for this little dinky workshop. Yeah, so break down, this is a prose version of doing this, but like break down how you came to these amounts. And this is for, I believe the, let me drink water. Hamilton's Community Enrichment Fund will ask for a budget breakdown. So you'll be submitting an extra prose version of this, as will the Ontario Arts Council. They ask after you do the budget on the website, they will ask you to do, how did you get these fees? It says it's optional, but I highly recommend you fill this out because it proves that you're competent. And this is the Canadian, the Canada Council for the Arts. This is actually for a project we just closed called the House Key Project, which we got full funding for. As you see, I have broken down all the fees in terms of math. There is no question as to how I got these fees. I also break down the hours to a T. Yeah, so like there is literally no question as to what these rates are. And if any explanation needs to happen, it's in my budget notes. Did this budget change after the project happened? Absolutely. I just did the final report on Sunday. But like in terms of submitting the budget, this is what I did. There is a breakdown all of your fees. I want to know as a juror how you got to those amounts. My red flags raised when I see you're being paid $1 million and I don't know why. About explanations, I have an Asian dad. He always told me to show my work. I show my work all the time. Is the space $2,000? Why is it $2,000? How much is it per hour? Why is the set budget astronomically high? It's always good to pay above union standards if you can. Paying below union standards on a grant budget is always a red flag. Think about this. You're all storytellers, you're artists, right? The budget on a grant is a narrative you're filling out that proves you know what you're doing and that you'll take care of the artists. If this doesn't make sense, as a juror, it tells me that you don't know how to take care of people. You might be an amazing artist, but if you don't know how to pay people equitably, then that means that I don't want to fund you maybe. Common budgeting mistakes. Paying your team poor wages / not paying them at all. If I see profit share that's not supported by an 82.2, that's a red flag right there. Assuming you will win all of your grants and not having a backup plan if some of the funding falls through. Banking too heavily on one pool of revenue. There's no explanation for something questionable, i.e., why are the producers being paid $50,000 and the actors are only paid $5K? Actually, the fun thing was in a recent project that I'm no longer the producer on, but I wrote a bunch of grants for it. It was a project for $100,000 and the producers, there were 3 of us and we were each paid $10,000. The question was, that's really high. Why is that? And then we explained we are producing a giant presenting series. The reason why this fee is so high is because people don't normally see work in Hamilton. You need 3 strong producers to actually get people to come out and actually to execute this project. And we got full funding. So if one of your fees is astronomically high and you could justify it in your budget notes. Because I want to trust you. That's why this fund exists, right? I want to give the money and walk away knowing you're not spending it on like a trip to Maui or whatever. I want to trust you financially and fill in the gaps with the budget. Okay, so what if you lose? When I submit to arts councils, I create 3 budgets. I create a dream budget, which is what I submit to all the granting bodies, projecting I win all the grants and can pay people exactly what they're worth. These numbers are not inflated. These numbers just assume I've won everything. but I have a realistic explanation for box office, a realistic explanation for other things as well. I then have a realistic budget, which I hide from the world and keep to myself. This is where I track how much I've actually won, lost, and fundraised, and I can adjust people's fees based on that. I then have a third budget called the OF, I lost everything. I keep this budget to myself. It assumes I've lost all the grants and allows me to make a realistic assessment of whether it's worth the probably unpaid labor to scrounge up money in other ways and sacrifice their producing skills by focusing on fundraising instead of producing. So I have 3 budgets going all at the same time. And my contingency statement to the granting bodies, which you usually have to do on one of the questions it asks you, what if you don't win the full amount? I base that on my OF I lost everything budget. Because like if I can't make the project happen, sometimes I'm like, I just won't do it because I don't want to put in all this fundraising work when I can just apply again and actually get the money quicker. Giving up until the next grant deadline is acceptable if you determine the amount of time and labor isn't worth it to fundraise, and you can get more money in less time by writing a better grant. Like if you've done your donor prospect and you're like, I don't really need this grant. If I lose this grant, I can fundraise, ask my little Jim, Bob, and Rick, and they'll give me $30,000 and I'll be fine. Absolutely, go for it. But my big thing is be kind for yourself. Don't produce bad art where your team is miserable, underpaid, and the work looks underfunded. If you need another year to get those 3,000 disco balls, take that year. That's labor. Make good art. Art should not be sacrificed because you have a budget loss. If you have a budget loss and it will compromise the integrity of the production, maybe it's not best to continue with the project. Moving forward. The best way to create a budget and stick to it is by creating a critical path, a series of deadlines for fundraising and producing goals. Have a system of tracking your spending. Be on top of receipts. As producer, you're the one who often makes sure people don't go over budget, although sometimes this can be a PM's job. The best way to budget is to make sure everyone gets paid based on union standards and fighting to take care of your team. For example, there's a trend in the theater industry right now where we're no longer working 6-day work weeks. We're going to a 5-day work week. So if you want to fight for that in your budget, just budget for it accordingly. Money and union standards make things real. We're doing this to make a living, right? As producers, it's our job to take care of our teams. Make sure you're doing that. Questions, comments, secrets, concerns. That brings us to the end of this presentation. I'm going to stop my share.